Alrighty, we'll get started, and then we'll catch him up when he walks in. We are up to chapter 8, but chapter 8 is pretty dependent. Yeah, everyone, there's going to be it's going to be a challenge today to remain focused. We have some competition because of the rain, but we'll power through. This chapter 8 is really a end of a three-chapter series, in the sense that, remember, let's remember the scheme of things. We're here in Tanya to understand at this point about our two souls. Starting from the end of chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe introduces us. Don't worry, we're still just getting started. The Alter Rebbe, from the end of chapter 1, the Alter Rebbe introduces us to the two souls. Then he spends a few chapters talking about the first soul, the godly soul, which all it wants is to connect to God, to live a godly existence and to reconnect back to its source. Then we transition over to the animal soul, and as we spent a while discussing, what is it about this soul? Why doesn't it want to do the right thing? And ultimately, the word that we'll use for it is it's selfish. It wants to do what feels good for it, whether that's whether that's the worst sins or just random things on the street, or even sometimes spiritual things. But it just wants to do what feels good for it. And then, in order to really understand this idea, we got into a multi-chapter arc about the concept of what happens when we do good and what happens when we do something wrong. And we explained that everything in the world has a godly energy. There is a godly energy that exists in everything. However, that godly energy, for the most part, is hidden. Your average, this folding table, from when it was made, you don't see the godly energy. It looks like a folding table, at least to me. If anyone has any special vision glasses, x-ray vision, let me know. But for the most part, when we look around the world, we see world. Our job is to extract that spark of holiness, which right now, for the most part, is neutral, and to utilize that in godly service, and to utilize that as a godly idea, in order that it should be uplifted. So there are some things that are completely holy already, right? A Torah scroll at this point, even you don't see God, but you see godliness. It is already redeemed. It is already freed. On the other hand, you also have some things that cannot be extracted. No matter what you do, those godly energies are trapped. They are trapped, and the problem is that when we do something with them, right? If someone, God forbid, eats non-kosher food, they are now internalizing that trapped negative energy. It's a godly energy at its core, but the only way we can utilize it, it is trapped and tainted by the shalosh klipos hatmeis, by the three impurities. What's the rest of the world? So the rest of the world, it's in its natural state. It is included in the klippa, right? Because, and this is again a very fundamental point, as we continue through these chapters, we are not talking now legally, right? Legally speaking, good morning. No worries. Legally speaking, it is completely legal to go home and enjoy a delicious steak dinner. Legally, as long as it's kosher, and you say a blessing before, it's 100% okay. Here we're talking Kabbalistically. We're talking about on a deeper level. Is that a good thing to do? Is that a positive experience? And so our barometer, when we're talking about Kabbalistically, we're talking about spiritually, is this action expressing godliness? When I'm enjoying a steak, am I experiencing God? Am I eating kosher? Yes. But that just means that it's what we used the word last week, mutar. It's allowed, right? The word for it in Hebrew, the word for something that's allowed is mutar, which really means untied. You're allowed to access it, as opposed to usur, which means tied up. Usur means forbidden, but the literal translation is tied up. Because some things, if the meat isn't kosher, then the godly energy is completely tied up. And you're unable to extract it. If the meat is kosher, well, now it's mutar, it's untied. But there's still a choice that we have to make. When I'm consuming this, am I consuming it for a godly reason? Am I expressing godliness? Or am I just feeding my animal soul? And the problem with looking at it through a Kabbalistical lens is that it's a zero-sum game. It's completely binary. Something is either godly or it's klippa. Those are the only two choices. Something either actively expresses godliness, is actively experiencing godliness, is actively godly, or not. Now again, there's a difference here. I'm not saying that if we eat a kosher steak for for no spiritual reason that we did a sin. We absolutely did not sin. But Kabbalistically, we did something wrong. Because this godly spark that was waiting from the moment of creation, especially since the moment of the creation of this cow, to be uplifted, to be included in godliness, we failed at that mission.
If the food, unkosher food, is the only thing available, then you can make that holy if it's needed for sustainment.
That's a great question. That question is going to get even stronger once we start our class today, and I'll revisit that question, because right now we're talking about...
It's in the portion this week. Esau is starving, and he has to eat something.
The extreme cases...
So what do you do?
About life and death situations. I'll just sort of hint at the answer. The answer is I'm not an expert on that, because it's a very fascinating Talmudic debate, where if I eat something that's not kosher because my life depends on it, right? There's nothing else to eat and someone has to eat. So you're allowed to eat it. God says, eat that non-kosher. Kosher is not as important as your life. There's a debate in the Talmud. Does that mean that it's no longer a sin? That it's no longer not allowed? Or does it mean that it's not allowed, but we're giving you a pass to do something that it's not allowed? And there's a debate in the Talmud. I don't know if there's a clear answer, and that's going to mirror on the spiritual side as well, as we'll see as we continue to discuss. But right now we're talking about, this is really a summary of chapter 7 that we discussed last week, and there's the video's up on YouTube if you'd like to have a more in-depth look at this discussion. The Alter Rebbe introduces us to the concept of even when I'm eating kosher, I am making a choice. If I have it for the right reasons, then I am extracting that godliness from within its shell, which the shell at that point is a very translucent, very easy to puncture, very easy to extract shell, right? And that becomes a holy steak. Holy cow. The other option is if I just eat it for my own enjoyment, if there is no spiritual benefit, then what happens is momentarily that spark descends into the 3 impure klippos. It descends into the other extreme. Because again, it's completely binary. It's like Schrodinger's cat. When it exists, I don't know which direction it's going to go, because when I eat it, if I have the right intentions and I utilize the energy for the right reasons, it gets spiritual. If I do it for the wrong reasons, it sinks into Shalosh Klippos Hatmeis, into the 3 levels of impurity. The difference is that because what I started off with was a kosher steak, even now that it's within the impure klippos, it's not permanent. And all I have to do in order to extract that energy is to now fix my mistake. Either by doing teshuvah, by repenting on a more broad level, or more specifically, right, we all had breakfast this morning, and I don't know how many of us actively thought about the fact that we ate breakfast, maybe we ate it for a neutral reason. But now we use that energy to get into our cars and to travel through the rain and come to a Torah class. So whatever our intentions were when we were eating that breakfast, now it's all good. Because now we've used that energy for the right reasons. However, as the Alter Rebbe finishes up in chapter 7, there is still a residue. Because at the end of the day, you consumed food, and while you were consuming it, it was heading in the wrong direction. So even after it's extracted, there is a residue, and that's more on the topic that we're going to discuss this week in chapter 8. But the Alter Rebbe also discusses last week how something that's non-kosher can never ever be extracted. Once I eat something non-kosher, right, and then I use that energy to come to a Torah class, it doesn't make a difference. If something is not kosher, if something is not allowed, if something is asur, is tied up, no matter what I do with that energy, it still remains tied up. So how can I extract it? So ultimately, either I have to wait for Mashiach to come. When Mashiach comes, the spirit of evil will depart, which means everything that was locked up and tied up will no longer be a problem, and that's when that will return. Or the Alter Rebbe discusses an extreme version of teshuvah, an extreme version of repentance, where the very sin that I did caused me to repent. The very fact that I was distant from God, the very fact, right, every time we do a sin, we move a little bit further away from God. And at a certain point, hopefully, at least once in our life, we look at ourselves and say, what in the world am I doing with my life? What in the world is going on? I'm so far from God. And then the repentance that comes from that, and this is a real life-altering, life-changing, completely 180, right? The difference of someone who decides to to start exercising because they want a new hobby, or the difference of someone who ate a really fatty dinner and almost had a heart attack, and then they start exercising and eating healthy. That's a completely different perspective and a completely different life change. And so too, when we are able to extract and when we're able to change our life because of our sins, that in most cases can turn back the clock. And those energies are in fact extracted, and as Rabbi says, that's why a Baal Teshuvah, somebody who repents in this this is not an easy thing. It's a lot easier said than done. To really, the distance itself is what motivates us. You hit rock bottom, and that's what propels you to bounce back up. When we do that, the very sins that we did that ended up motivating us to return become a positive merit for us. And that's why a Baal Teshuvah, somebody who repents, can reach levels that a tzaddik never could. Because a tzaddik only has his mitzvahs propelling him. A Baal Teshuvah, a proper repentant who really does it for the right reasons, has his mitzvahs propelling him and his averos and his sins. The exception to that we discussed last week is if there's a physical manifestation of that sin. The extreme example the Alter Rebbe gave is someone who commits a sin and bears an illegitimate child. So as long as that child exists in the world, there's a physical embodiment of his sin, and therefore there's no teshuvah that can fix that. And that was sort of the discussion that we had at length last week in chapter 7 about the different levels and what kind of extraction is required when something sinks into the klippah. If it just sinks in the klippah momentarily because it's really kosher, it's really okay, but I just used it for the wrong reason, that's super easy. Just do a basic level of teshuvah, or even just use that exact energy for the right reason, and retroactively, well, not retroactively, but now you pull it out, and now it's all good, except for a little bit of residue. If it's usur, if we did something that's wrong, then it's completely tied up. Using all the energy in the world for all the best reasons doesn't change the fact that it was wrong. You need an extreme level of teshuvah. And the final version of some things that are so far gone that unfortunately there is no way to extract it because there's a physical manifestation. Another example is given is if somebody commits a sin and that causes a chilul Hashem. That causes now a desecration of God's name. Unfortunately, we can't go too long without there being headlines of a Jewish person doing something wrong. And that, no matter what, when you see a Jewish person with a yarmulke getting arrested, that causes a tremendous desecration of God's name. And no amount of repentance can take that away. Because nothing can change the fact that now there are many, many people in the world that have a bitter taste about God, a bitter taste about the Jewish people, and that is unfortunately unchangeable. The person can do all the teshuvah they want by themselves, but they can't change what happened outside.
You recognize the sin, and you say you're going to change, and you do change, doesn't that get rid of the sin?
So there's two types of repentance. There's repentance that says that from now on you're okay. From now on, you made a mistake, but let's start a new page. The old page is still there. You don't change the past. There's a great example that Rabbi Gordon, who's from Southern California, when he teaches this, he teaches with the idea of, imagine there's a couple, and the wife is reading the newspaper by the breakfast table, and she says, you know what? I really think this stock is going to pop today. Do me a favor, when you get to the office, call a broker, invest $100 in this stock. All right, the guy goes to work, completely forgets about it. Comes home that night, and his wife has a steak dinner, and everything is ready to go, and she's so excited. Says, what are you so excited for? Didn't you see? The stock went up 1,000%. Our $100 is now $100,000. We can pay off our mortgage. The guy says, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I forgot to do it. I didn't do it. I'm so sorry. Okay. Now, what happens now moving forward? Ultimately, he has he can say I'm sorry and he can buy all the chocolates and the flowers in the world. It won't change the fact that what was done was done. Or in this case, what wasn't done wasn't done. There's nothing you can do to change it. Now, I'm adding to the parable here. But what if he's so upset about it, he's so whatever about it, that he goes out and he takes a second job and in a year he makes back that same $100,000? Obviously the exact details are kind of faulty at this point. But then that very mistake was what motivated him to fix it. So there's two types of teshuvah. There's turning a new page, but I still got to deal with what's on the old page. And then there's erasing the old page, and now we're starting fresh, really turning back the clock. To turn back the clock is almost impossible, because it really means that those very items themselves, and the reason why it's so hard for that to be the case, and we're going to discuss this more as we continue to discuss sort of the battle that we have. Every time we dip into the 3 impure klippos, every time we experience that, it dulls us a little bit. It desensitizes us. And so, unfortunately, it normalizes doing sin or doing something wrong. And so, unfortunately, usually the more we sink into a life of sin and a life of not doing what's right, or a life of imperfection, what usually ends up happening is that we're less and less likely to do teshuvah. It's never impossible to do teshuvah. There is an extreme version, and that's what we're talking about here, where you sink so low and so think that the very, you wake up one morning and you say, oh my goodness, I completely don't care about my relationship with God. I am so far gone. I've committed so many transgressions. I've sunk so low, and that distance itself is what motivates you. And we'll discuss this dichotomy of how continuing to do the wrong thing desensitizes us as we continue in Tanya. But for now, I want to continue along that vein. Chapter 8 continues to discuss the ideas of what happens when I do something wrong. When someone eats non-kosher food. So last week we discussed if someone actively does it. Somebody actively chooses to eat non-kosher food, that can never be fixed. And the only way to extract those energies, the only way to fix that mistake is to do an almost impossible task. This week the Alter Rebbe starts off with a question, but what if it was done accidentally? What if somebody accidentally consumed non-kosher? Now, accidental could be they didn't realize it was non-kosher. They didn't realize kosher was a thing. There's a lot of reasons how accidentally could happen. But what happens then? And this is, I think, especially for what we've studied so far, one of the most reality-checking chapters of the Tanya. And because the Alter Rebbe, again, we're talking on a spiritual level. We're talking about, halachically, if somebody accidentally consumed non-kosher, there's a very easy answer. You repent, you turn the new page, and you're fine. But here we're talking about on a spiritual level. And as we just discussed, consuming non-kosher is like consuming poison for the soul. And you ask someone who, God forbid, had some poison, does it make a difference if they did it on purpose or by accident? No. The consuming of the poison itself happened. And the cure isn't any different whether it was done on purpose or by accident. Again, I want to just reiterate that we're talking now spiritually speaking. Halachically speaking, there are solutions and you take care of it and it's done. But especially because when we're talking about food becomes part of us. And so in addition, more than any other sin, most other sins, you do them, it's all spiritual anyway. And therefore, it's easier to clean up. Problem is, food becomes part of who we are. And unfortunately, when we consume non-kosher food, that becomes part of who we are. And this is not a hypothetical. Over the summer, my family and I were in Australia, and as we're getting on the plane on the way home, we suddenly got news that there was a massive scandal in the community in Australia, that there was this kosher cafe that turned out wasn't actually kosher, and they were fooling the kosher certification. It was a big problem. It was a dairy cafe, and unfortunately, myself and my family had ate there a couple of times. And so suddenly we're all scrambling. What do we do now? We consume non-kosher. We consumed, and as we'll see, the exact details are still under investigation. So not knowingly. So halachically speaking, we're in the clear. It was a mistake. God knows it's a mistake, and we're good to go. We're not going to get punished for that sin. But spiritually speaking, these are tremendous spiritual fault when we consume non-kosher. Even accidentally, as the Alter Rebbe is about to explain. In that case, we found out, especially because it was a dairy product, that there's a number you give to charity that numerically corresponds to the word chalav, which means dairy, milk, and that can counteract the spiritual side effects. The one thing, the most powerful tool we have is tzedakah, as we'll continue to discuss throughout Tanya. Tzedakah tatzal mo'maves, tzedakah saves from death, tzedakah mekrevet geula, tzedakah brings closer to the redemption. And so generally speaking, tzedakah is always a good antidote, and that's what we were told to do, is every person who had it should give X amount of dollars, I think $51 or $54 to charity, and that's the solution. Why was that such a big deal? Because we're not talking about halachically. Halachically, it was a mistake. God knows it was a mistake, you're in the clear. We're talking about spiritually. And spiritually, for the rest of my life, there's part of my anatomy, part of my DNA, which was powered and came into being from non-kosher. As the Alter Rebbe starts, and we're switching over for those that are to a different style. Hopefully, it won't be too jarring. But this is directly from Chabad.org. This is a printout from the Lessons in Tanya. So if anybody wants to just start using just the Lessons in Tanya book, if you have those at home, you're definitely welcome to bring those. But it might be a little bit more complicated to follow along because the page numbers are going to be different. But on the handout that we gave out, we're at the bottom of page 1, chapter 8. There is an additional aspect in the matter of forbidden foods, for which reason they are called Isser bound. Right. So last week in chapter 7, and the video's up on YouTube for those that want to follow along. The main thing about the fact that it's not allowed is that if you do it on purpose, you can never extract those. But the Alter Rebbe continues on page number 2. Mipnei sha'af mi sha'achal Michael Isser b'loy hoida l'shem shemayim lavid Hashem b'koyach achilahi. Even if one ate a forbidden food unwittingly, and his intention in eating it was for the sake of heaven, i.e., in order to serve God, and with the energy derived from it. Right? So again, if it was allowed, that's perfect. You just ate kosher food with the right reasons, it gets upgraded immediately, everything's fine. The problem is, you had there's 4 options you could go, or 3 options, right? There's right food, right reason, straight up. Wrong food, right reason, definitely down. Now you have wrong food, but right reason, what happens? Right? So again, you have right food, right reason, you can have like a square, we have right food, right reason, kosher food for the right reason, it gets upgraded into the realm of kedusha, of holiness. Wrong food, non-kosher food for the wrong reason, definitely down the other way. You have right food, kosher food, but for the wrong reason, temporarily gets stuck in kedusha, in klipa, but it's very easy to extract it.
What would be the wrong reason of having kosher?
Selfish reasons. I'm having a steak dinner for my own because I want to enjoy it. And as we discussed, that same steak dinner, you can have it because it helps you clear your mind, right? It helps you concentrate, it gives you the energy, and we'll get into today sort of a discussion about, that's a really good question, really. What is the right reason for consuming? It's kosher, that should be enough. I found the symbol, I'm good to go. But because we're talking about on the spiritual level, there's another thing now. Why am I eating it? Am I eating it to satisfy my primal desires? Then it might be kosher, but it's still not holy. If I'm eating for the right reason, and some people, you can have the same really expensive glass of whiskey. One person drinking it because they want to enjoy it. It's kosher, which you have to verify. Whiskey's not that simple, but it's kosher. But if it's the wrong reason, it's still unholy. If it's for the right reason,
and what would be the wrong reason?
Selfish reasons.
Just that you want to enjoy it?
Yes.
And what would be the right reason?
For either the sanctification of God's name, right? To have sitting at a kiddush, saying l'chaim because it's Shabbos and because you're spending, that's a holy reason.
Maybe a blessing wasn't said beforehand.
A blessing is, I think, we're not specifically the aspect we're talking about. A blessing can affect if it's right. But even if you said a blessing, right, we were talking about this on Tuesday night, how blessing is acknowledgement that God gave it to you. But if you acknowledge that God gave it to you and then you still use it for selfish reasons, that's still the wrong reason. It's selfish. Because again, we're talking now, spiritually speaking, it's very binary. If this is either for God or for me. Last week, he gave, in chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe gave an example of there's certain sages which talk about how, you can't, they couldn't concentrate until the stomach was full. And some of them were very sensitive, and so they needed to have a really good, and the reason I keep calling it a steak dinner, because that was referenced last week, in last week's chapter. Specifically that certain rabbis would have to enjoy a really good, hearty, nutritious dinner, and then they could focus on their learning. I gave the example last week as well, that there's, these days, what we know about the dangers of smoking is a very, it changes the dynamics a lot, because to actively consume something that harms us is different. But before it was common knowledge, before really we knew what we were doing, there were many rabbis who needed to smoke in order to focus. Or at least that's the way they felt. It grounded them, it's the kind of thing that helped them focus.
So they were in a fog every Shabbat?
They were, yeah. You know what? It really is. Sort of the There was one rabbi, I don't remember who it is, so I'm not going to say a name, but he said that, while he smoked, he couldn't understand how you can possibly focus without a cigarette. After he quit, he couldn't possibly understand how he was able to focus with a cigarette. Right? Because these things are obviously, but before we knew it, back 100 years ago, for a rabbi that was trying to learn Torah, and it's really hard to focus, and he would smoke a cigarette, that was a holy cigarette. It sounds weird to say, but if we're doing it for the right reasons, and another example is for Shabbat. If we're consuming food, the most luxurious, special, incredible food, but why are we doing it? Because it's Shabbat, because it's a holiday, because it's a meal of a festival. Suddenly, that same thing, it's for the right reasons. If we were to consume that on a random Tuesday, and it's just because I'm in the mood of that steak dinner, that's the wrong reasons. It's kosher, but it's still the wrong reason. And the fact that another example we brought last week was humor. Right? To sit around cracking jokes with each other is generally speaking not a positive thing. We'll talk a little bit more about that this week. But what if it's a rabbi starting off a sermon and he wants to get everyone at ease and wants to comment, wants to set the mood, and he says a joke? That's a holy joke. That's a holy humor. And so the same joke, it depends on the context because it's kosher. It's clean, right? We're not talking about dirty jokes. We're talking about a clean, completely allowed idea. So then, you have that question. Is it for the right reasons? Are you utilizing it for the correct way? Then you're good. If not, well then temporarily it sinks down. Right? But what if we're sitting around cracking jokes, wasting time? But then one of us goes and we take that joke and we use that to form a friendship with someone else, and we use that to pivot into the mitzvah of loving our friend. Well then maybe they just extracted that energy that was sunk down because it was done for the wrong reasons, but now they extract it and use it for the right reasons.
So you always have to have mindfulness all the time, 100% of the time.
100%. Because
that's hard.
100%. No one said this is going to be easy. Because really what we're talking about here, and as we'll see, no human, we can list throughout history maybe one person that actually lived like this. And the Alter Rebbe is going to list that. Because this is such it's really hard. And again, I want to stress again because this is really, this chapter is going to get pretty judgmental. And I want to therefore remind, we're not talking halachically. Halachically, the fact that it's a mistake or the fact that it's allowed, that's all you have to know about it. But just like, the reason why I'm stressing this, because we're going to go back and talk about, in chapter 1, we said there's two ways of looking at the terms tzaddik, righteous person, rasha, wicked person, and beinoni, middle person. We said halachically speaking, right, on paper, when judgment day comes, a tzaddik is mostly good, a rasha is mostly bad, and a beinoni is somewhere average. But that's halachically speaking. Here we're learning the inner dimensions, what's really going on, a peek beneath the hood. And spiritually speaking, things are way shifted. A tzaddik is someone who's completely perfect. A rasha is someone who even momentarily sins in a tiny different way. And now we can start to understand why that is. Because even not sinning, but utilizing something for the wrong reason, a kosher thing for the wrong reason, unfortunately, fails that test of either godly or not. Is it a sin? No. Is it godly? Also not. So by definition, it's unholy.
So when you say it's halakha,
yes,
we're saying we're within the law.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We are 100% within the law. And the Alter Rebbe, throughout the next couple of pages, as we continue to read this chapter, he's going to explain what's the difference of, so what? If it's halachically allowed, what's the difference? Right? Why do I care if a spiritually it's misaligned, if I consumed unholy? And the answer is going to be, and this is why I was going to give this introduction in a couple of paragraphs, but we can do it here. A lot of this chapter is going to talk about the exact consequences of our action. That if I consume non-kosher, what happens to my soul? If I speak, words wasting time, what happens to my soul? All these things, we're going to start talking about what happened to the soul after 120 years. After it's no longer connected to a body. Why does the Alter Rebbe suddenly start talking about that? Why is that relevant? Why? Because by understanding what happens to us, we can understand the depth and the problem with what we're doing. Right? And the difference between committing a sin and doing something incorrect and being unholy is that a sin is something you really have to be, quote-unquote, punished for. Judaism doesn't believe in punishment per se. Everything is about cleansing the soul. But just like if you have a shirt, and if it's a little bit of something on it and you just wipe it off, that's very different than if it gets stained and you have to throw it into a washing machine or send it to the dryer. There's different levels of how far something has to be cleaned. And whether or not it has to be cleaned or rinsed off. And our soul is the same way. All of these things that we do wrong, right? Our soul at its core is completely holy. Anything unholy, by definition, taints the soul. And so suddenly we have to figure out what happens with a tainted soul, which we're not talking about, we're talking about all of us. Every single person that exists, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say, on some level tainted our soul. Our soul is complete and perfect. We're human. By definition, we're not supposed to be perfect, which means we're going to fail. What happens when we fail? So it depends what level of a failure is. If we fail with actual sin and actual problems, then we go into what's called Gehenna, purgatory, which is a whole, that's like going into the super wash cycle in your washing machine. But for things that are just not sins, they're just unholy, so then there are processes that the soul goes through that they're not pleasant, they're painful, but they're not as extreme as going down into Gehenna itself, into purgatory, as we're gonna see.
Talk about the final judgment.
The final judgment. This is all after 120 years. But we'll discuss that more as we get into the details that the Alter Rebbe is going to say. But for now, continuing on page 2, we're talking about someone who ate non-kosher accidentally, but they did it for the right reasons. They sat down and they poured themselves a big cup of coffee or a glass of milk, and they said, I'm going to use this to help me focus as I learn this. And it wasn't only hypothetical, as the Alter Rebbe continues, V'gam po'al v'asakein, v'karav v'hispala b'koyach achilahi. Moreover, even if he actually carried out his intention, having studied and prayed with the energy derived from that food. These paragraphs that are in the middle of the page, those are sort of they're really supposed to be in shaded boxes, if my printer was a little bit better. So we're going to skip those, but they give more context and are helpful for when we're studying. All right, so what happens if you eat the wrong food, non-kosher food, with the right intentions and the right outcomes? The vitality contained in it does not ascend or become clothed in the words of Torah and prayer that he studied and praised with the energy of that food, as is the case of primitive food. When I use kosher food energy to pray, well, not that prayer is powered by that kosher energy, and it all gets uplifted and it all becomes holy. With non-kosher food, it's tied up, it's chained down. It's anchored to the floor. It cannot be uplifted no matter what I do with it. Because it is held captive in the power of the Sitra Achra, of the 3 unclean klippos, which do not permit the energy of the food to be elevated to sanctity. The Alter Rebbe is going to say this is not only biblical commandments. This is even things that are rabbinic in nature. Once the code of Jewish law says it's not allowed, it's completely tied up, which is a fascinating mental exercise. There are certain things that the rabbis instituted going through the generations. We can pinpoint to a rabbi, to a person, or to an era where that was done. So imagine you're sitting, in the courthouse, and one example of this is cheese, milk, and chicken. Right? The Torah says you cannot have meat and milk. Very specifically talks about a goat, which means the biblical prohibition of milk and meat is just about animals, domestic animals, and milk. So, in theory, chicken, a bird, and milk is allowed from the Torah. Problem is, as the generations were going and as things were getting more unclear and people getting more corrupted, it's very hard to tell if your empanada is chicken and thing or beef and thing. It's very similar textures, very similar proteins. People usually associate them with each other, they're next to each other in the grocery aisle, and therefore at a certain point the rabbis instituted a rabbinic law, which is that cheese and chicken are not allowed. That chicken isn't, that poultry is included in that idea.
So, even though you're violating just the fence around the law,
yes,
you're saying once the rabbis decide, it's the same as violating.
Because ultimately, are we allowed to do it? No. The reasons might be different, and there are halachic differentiations if it was done, if there's a mistake or if you're not sure. There are differences if it's rabbinic or biblical in nature. We're not going to deny that. But ultimately, right now, for me to sit down and consume this is a rabbinic. It's not allowed. Even if it's just rabbinic, as the Alter Rebbe continues on the bottom of page 2, even this is so even if forbidden by reason of rabbinic prohibition, for the words, i.e. the prohibitions of the scribes, are even more stringent than the words of the Torah. That's not talking literal, it's talking about on the spiritual sense, but we'll leave that for now. Because of this whole idea that no matter what, even if it was accidental, and I'll just reference back to what Len asked at the beginning, what if I'm forced to do it? right? What if I needed to save my life? So then you get into that question about, is it, if I'm allowed to have something non-kosher, does that mean it's kosher for me now? It's untied and therefore I'm allowed to do it? Or does it just mean that for me it's okay to be tied down in this way? There's no practical difference. And after 120 years, we'll get the answer, and I'm sure God will judge us favorably, but we'll deal with that then. That's a great question that I don't know the answer to because it's not really discussed one-on-one. It's discussed on the Talmudic, on the halachic end, there's sort of that debate. On the esoteric, on the spiritual side, I haven't seen it, but it roughly lines up with that same question, and so we'll leave it for now. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe says, when we have a temptation to do something, there's a massive difference if that temptation is to do something that's allowed, right? Because again, to have my temptation to enjoy a delicious steak dinner for my own pleasure is very different from the temptation that I might feel to consume non-kosher. Why? Because non-kosher is completely foreign to me. No matter the circumstance, no matter what, I can never extract it, and therefore the word that he uses is it's a non-Jewish idea. Why? Because it's completely foreign to the Jew. For a Jewish person, that non-kosher has no relation to me at all. Therefore, the temptation to consume non-kosher is called a non-Jewish temptation. It has no relevance, no connection to Jewish people. On the other hand, temptation to consume kosher, it's still a temptation. It's still, as he calls it, a demon, because it's a temptation to do something that's unholy, but at least it's Jewish. It has a connection to me. I have some relation to it. I could extract it if I do that for the right reasons. As he continues on page 3, גם היצר והכוח המסעבל לדברים האסורים הוא שד משדים נוכרין שהוא יצר של אומות העולם שנשמסים משלוש כיבוש הטמאס. Therefore, the Yetzer Hara and the force of the evil impulse and the force that lusts after forbidden things is one of the non-Jewish demons, which is the Yetzer Hara of the nations, whose soul derives from the 3 unclean klippos. מה שאין היצר הרע והכוח המסעבל לדברים המותרים ומעלת תבוסי הוא שד משד יהודאין לפי שיכול לחזור לקדוש הקדוש. On the other hand, the evil impulse and the craving force after permissible things, even when done solely to satisfy one's cravings, in which case, as mentioned earlier, even the permissible matter descends into utter evil of the 3 unclean klippos, still it is one of the Jewish demons, as it is, as it were, a Jewish evil impulse. For it, the vitality of a permitted thing can be reverted to holiness, as we explained above.
The bad thought without the action is that, you want to, you walk into a restaurant and the lobster smells great and you desire it, but I can't do it because it's not a kosher food.
The desire itself is not a problem. The impulse itself, as we're going to discuss throughout the chapters, that is our life. Our life is going through life and having these impulses. The question is, what do I do next? Do I dwell on it? Right? Because even once I have that impulse, even continuing to think about it and dream about it is already doing something wrong. The impulse itself is not a problem. It's part of being human. The question is, what happens next? Do I act on it? Definitely a problem. Do I speak about it? Still a problem. Or do I even mentally continue to dream and to drool and to think? That's still continuing along, to maintain that thought process is a problem. The initial impulse is not, because that's part of being human. But the continuation and the dreaming about it, the very idea we mentioned in our Tuesday night class about how at a certain point we're supposed to say, or maybe it was a different class. At a certain point we're supposed to say, thank God, there's a lot to keep track of. We're supposed to say, I want to do something wrong. What can I do that, really I want to enjoy that lobster? What can I do that God doesn't want me to enjoy?
So Jimmy Carter said, I've lusted in my heart many times, and he saw that as a sin. Do we Jews see that as a sin?
The lust itself, no. Because that's part of being human. And the Alter Rebbe, I don't want to spoil the rest of Tanya, but the Alter Rebbe is going to spend a while on the fact that can be pretty depressing. The fact is that after working myself for 70, 80 years, I'm still lusting after the same temptations. That can be pretty disheartening. And the Alter Rebbe is going to address that. Because the lust itself is our life story. Everything after that is the question. Do I think about it more? Or do I immediately push it out of my mind? The lust itself? No. Do I continue to dream about it? That starts to become a problem. Continuing on the bottom of page 3. Right, so even though lusting or dreaming or the temptation for kosher things is the quote-unquote Jewish demon. It's a demon. It's still temptation to do something unholy, but it's Jewish. It has a connection to us. It's something that we can work with. But so here it continues. Although vitality of permitted food eaten out of the body, out of bodily desire, can revert to holiness through the person of repentance, nevertheless, before it has reverted to holiness, it is sitra achra and klippa. The fact of the matter is that while I consume it for the wrong reason, it's kosher, but it's for the wrong reason, it is unholy. And because it's unholy, because it's not holy, it's by definition unholy, and it is trapped in the sitra achra and klippa. Now, because it's kosher, there's a very easy solution to that. Continuing on page 4, v'gam achikach yeshumum menisha davuk bagof. And even afterwards, after the person repented and elevated the energy of the food to holiness, right? So even though you do that, and it's not that hard, you say, I'm sorry, Hashem, ask for forgiveness legitimately. Like, we're not talking about playing games. Or you use that energy for good. Now it's elevated to holiness, but still the fact of the matter is a trace of it remains attached to the person's body. Why? Because we're talking about food here. Food leaves a literal physical trace on our body. Since each item of food and drink that one ingests immediately becomes blood and flesh of his flesh. It becomes part of who I am. So now, part of who I am was momentarily klippa, was momentarily unholy. I've elevated it. It's no longer there. But the fact of the matter is, there's still something there, right? If you put tomato sauce in a Tupperware container, you can take it out, there's still that residue. There's still going to be it's no longer there, and you can use that for anything else. It's clean, but it still has that residue. And that's what happens to our soul as well. And so now the Alter Rebbe is going to start talking about, when we look at what happens to the soul, what the cleansing process is, we'll see the different levels of how affected our soul is. And he continues, "V'lechein tzarech haguf l'chibud hakever. L'linkoisei l'tarosei mitumasei shekibel bahanos olam hazeh v'tainugoisav mitumas klipos nega v'shedin udayin." This is why the body must undergo purgatory of the grave, a specific punishment for the body, in order to cleanse it and purify it of the uncleanliness which it has received from the enjoyment of mundane things and pleasures, which are from the impurity of klipas noga and of the Jewish demons, i.e. the Jewish yitzhar, which desires permitted matters. Even just that temptation, the body has to be cleansed. And it's interesting because here usually we talk about the soul going through its thing, but ultimately in the world to come, the body and soul are intertwined, and the soul is limited and chained by the body in a certain respect, which is why there's a lot of things, in Jewish culture about burial. We do it right away, and we don't embalm, because the body's process of degradation and returning back to its source, back to soil, the body's decomposing is directly connected to the soul's ability to soar higher and higher, because they're connected, intertwined. And so if the body is tainted, the soul's going to be limited. The soul's going to be held back by that. It's klipas noga, it's the quote-unquote Jewish demons, but it's still a residue. There is still something there. Therefore, the body has to undergo a certain process called chibud hakever. Now, who can avoid that? Only someone who never ever enjoyed even from permitted things without, for the wrong reasons. As he continues, Ella imkain mishaloi nenema elam hazim mikol yamav. Unless one has never derived enjoyment from this world all his life, i.e. either he actually derived no enjoyment, or his enjoyment was not of this world, since all his actions were completely for the sake of mitzvahs and holiness. The one example, looking through history, that we know about that for sure, is, as he continues, Rabbeinu HaKadosh. As is the case with Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda the Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda the compiler of the Mishnah, he was fabulously wealthy. He was on par with the Roman emperor at the time. They were buddies, they had grown up together. He was royal, he was Jewish royalty, and he lived like it. They say, what was the extreme luxury of those days? That they had fresh produce year round. Why? Because they had connections and abilities to ship things in from all over the world. That was the epitome of luxury in those days. These days we call that a refrigerator, right? But he lived an opulent life. As the representative of the Jewish people, he had to rub shoulders. He had to play the game. But at the end of his life, he held out his 10 fingers and he said, "God, you know that never in my life have I enjoyed of this world for my own sake, even one tiny finger." And sure enough, after he passed, a heavenly voice called out and said, "That's correct," and he's right on his way upstairs. But that's an extreme version. And that, the Alter Rebbe, looking back through history, can find one person that we know about that for sure. Why? Because we're talking about permitted. We're talking about even a quote-unquote, well, you would call it tzaddik, who never sinned in his life. Did they enjoy it for their own reasons? Or did they enjoy it for godly reasons? And it's super, super hard, impossible practically, to say that I enjoyed it fully for God. Rabbi Huda, I'll just finish out that paragraph. Yehuda, the prince, who said at the time of his demise that he had no enjoyment of this world, even to the extent of his small finger. Now, the Alter Rebbe is going to continue in this vein to talk about different ramifications, different consequences of when we do things for wrong, not sinning per se, but just doing it for the wrong reason. And the next example he's going to give is not about food, but it's about wasting time, idle chatter. So now, the problem with idle chatter is that it very easily slips into something far worse. Either it slips into wasting time, right? Wasting time of wasting time of learning Torah is a sin, as we discussed in chapter 1. So the Alter Rebbe is going to have a very specific case of what does it mean to be idle chatter. That's not a sin. It's also not gossip, right? How easy is it for idle chatter, for just shooting the breeze to turn into gossiping? Super easy. Those are both sins. There's also, the Alter Rebbe doesn't address this directly, there is a way for idle chatter to be holy. Idle chatter is neutral. It's idle. It's nothing. It can very easily fall into sin if it's either wasting time or gossip, but it can also very easily be used for the right reasons, right? Whether you're using it to clear your mind, to take a break, right? After learning intensely for a few hours, you need a break for 15 minutes to give your mind a rest, so you sit and you talk about something neutral. Or using it to build a relationship. We have a mitzvah to love every Jew as ourselves, to go out and build relationships and to draw every Jew close. Now, if I were to go out with a code of Jewish law and that was the way I would introduce myself to people, that wouldn't work. It requires to sit down and talk and spend time, and all of that is holy because it's for a proper purpose. But the Alter Rebbe is going to say, a very idle chatter for the sake of idle chatter, where it's not a sin, but also not holy, bears consequences. It's not a sin, but it's also not holy, which means by definition, it's unholy. As the Alter Rebbe continues on page 5, we're down after those things by the Hebrew letters. Al dvarim betelim beheter, kigoyin ama erich eniachol lilmaid. As for innocent idle chatter, such as in the case of an ignoramus who cannot study. Tzarich letahir nafshe mitumazu deklipazu ayidei gugulim bekafakela k'mishakasuv bezohar beparshas b'shalach daf nuntes. He must have his soul cleansed from the impurity of this klippa through it being rolled in the hollow of a sling, as it said in the Zohar pasuk b'shalach. So now, idle chatter leaves no lasting imprint on your body. So your body is not involved in this process, but the soul wasted time. The soul didn't live up to potential, and therefore it goes into this process before it can be uplifted. The soul has to be, it's called being flung from one end of the earth to the other. Obviously, the soul is not a dodgeball. The soul is then flung from one end of the soul. There's many explanations about what this means. The one that I've heard that really fits with this concept is the soul is not the punishment, but the pain, the cleansing pain that the soul feels is by being thrown from one extreme to the other. On one side, it's enjoying the most incredible divine enjoyments, but then it's flung to the other extreme where it's in the most incredible physical enjoyments, and it's being flung back and forth. And that process is very painful, and it's also a lesson to the soul. Right? Every punishment or every consequence is always midah keneged midah. The punishment, I'm using the word punishment, I want to just reiterate, there's no punishment for the sake of being vindictive in Judaism. Every punishment is a cleansing process. But in this case, the consequence is reminding the soul what you could have done. You could have utilized your time better, and you didn't. And that's this process of being flung back and forth. But that's just for idle chatter. But what if it's actually wrong? What if it's sinful? Continuing on page 6. Avoli diburim asurim kamei leitzanis v'lashon hara kiyetze behem. But in regards to forbidden speech, such as scoffing and slander and the like, which being prohibited stem from the 3 completely unclean klippos, the hollow of the sling alone does not suffice to cleanse and remove the impurity of the soul. Later the Gehenim, but the soul must descend into Gehenim, purgatory, which is a greater punishment and thus more effective at the cleansing of the soul. Because again, when we're talking about sinful, that's when it has to go to Gehenim. It has to be cleansed properly with a deep cycle wash. If we're just talking about residue or the effects of clean klippa, of shalosh klippa, of not shalosh klippa, not sinful, but just non-holy, unholy, that is a much cleaner. That you go over to the sink and you just rinse off your shirt for a couple seconds and the mess goes away. So the Alter Rebbe, in order to give us context on the effects that this has on us, the Alter Rebbe tells us what the consequences are, and then we can appreciate what we have done wrong. Now, continuing, what's another example of a problem that we do? Right? So, what if this idle chatter is not specifically gossip, but it's wasting time you could have spent studying Torah? In the neutral example, the Alter Rebbe specifically chose an ignoramus, someone who can't be studying Torah. It's not like they could be utilizing their time better. They don't know how to study. What do you want from them? But here we're talking about someone who could be studying, but does something else. So too, with one who engages in the study of Torah, but occupies himself instead with idle chatter. So that already is a sin. That's not, neutral time, because actively wasting time is a problem. The hollow thing alone cannot effectively scour and cleanse the soul. But it must receive the severe penalties which are meted out for neglect of Torah in particular. Apart from the general retribution of the neglect of a positive commandment through indolence, namely the purgatory of the snow is explained elsewhere. There are different types of purgatory. There's the ones that we do, mitzvahs that we do, sins that we do out of a passion. We have to go through a fiery, quote unquote, again, not physical fire, but a passionate Gehenna problem, because it was done with passion. It has to be cleansed with fire, which represents passion. Things that we do out of laziness or out of wasting or sort of that style of sloth have to be cleansed in a Gehenna shel sheleg, a purgatory of snow. Again, the cold representing the apathy and the slowness and the laziness that brought that on. So again, we're not dwelling on the details of exact punishment. First of all, I don't know if we have time for that, but also because the exact details are not what we're here to study. We're not here to figure out what's going to happen with our soul. We're not here to scare anyone. We're here to realize that actions have consequences, and actions that get our soul so stained that it's a sin requires Gehenna. Actions that leave a residue or are more neutral require less. Still have to be cleansed, because the soul, the ultimate holy, before it can go back up to the heavens and appreciate ultimate holiness, it has to be cleansed. Continuing on page 7.
Because nobody lives a perfect life, we're all not looking forward to, purgatory, but we're all going to have to go through purgatory.
Yes. That's connected with the idea of when we say Kaddish. We say Kaddish for a departed loved one. Why do we say Kaddish? So, the main reason we say Kaddish is because it's a merit for their soul. Because of that, we try to say 16 Kaddashim, 16 times we say Kaddish. Each one represents an hour and a half, 90 minutes of time off. So you say 16, that gives you a full 24 hours of a reduced sentence. But how long do we say Kaddish for?
9 months.
So our Chabad custom we say for 11 months. Why? Because the maximum sentence, the washing machine cycle, the max that can last is 12 months. 12 months. Now, if I were to say Kaddish for someone that I love for a whole 12 months, I'm basically saying they are the worst possible version and they needed the whole 12 months. So because of that, we go back 1 month, we say it for 11 months. The custom is still to be around while Kaddish is said, so you can still sort of get the merit for saying Kaddish without actively saying Kaddish. That's the custom. But actually saying Kaddish in the Chabad custom, we only say it until the 11th month, because we don't want to be saying, they got the maximum sentence. But every single person we say Kaddish for, because yes, as he said, some part of this process, every single person has to go through. It's not vindictive, it's not evil, it's not that God's mad at us. It's the fact is our soul, which came down into this world, it came down perfectly clean. While it was here, it got dirty. Before it goes back up, it has to be re-cleansed, it has to be repaired, it has to be fixed up. And by the way, just for some context, we know that the soul chooses to come down. The soul knows what's going to happen. It knows it's going to go down. The soul is perfectly clean. It knows it's going to go down to this world. It's going to get dirty, and it's going to have to go through that process to go back up. And yet the soul still chooses to go down. Why? Because the uplifting, the advancement, the upgrading that the soul gets because of the good that it's done, that's forever. So the soul knows, yes, I'll go down temporarily, get dirty, but the dirty, the sins, the schmutz, that's all temporary. The upgrades, the spiritual upliftment that the soul gets, that's permanent. And so the soul makes a cost-benefit analysis and says, it's worth it for me to go down and go through that process, even if I'll have to suffer the consequences. It's worth it for the soul. In a couple of minutes, they're going to start bringing kids up here because the playground is too wet. So I just want to quickly finish off the chapter. and continue in this theme of, I'm happy to stay if there's any questions. I'm happy to stay after and we can talk in the hallway or whatever. I just want to make sure that they have time to set up for what they need. So as he continues, right, so what happens if we waste time? Wasting Torah time is a sin. I'm sorry. Sorry. Where are we? That was just page. Now we're on page 7. Al Rebbe is going to finish now with the topic of what if we're not learning Torah, but what if we're learning other things? And again, the high standard of what we're talking about here is that we're not talking about sinning. We're talking about occupying ourselves with things that aren't by definition holy. One of those things is, do you know what time and how many more minutes we have? Yeah.
She's coming up.
Right now?
Yeah, in just a minute.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, we'll finish up now. I'll finish this up in next week's class. But the idea that we're discussing here is even the very act of learning curiosities, learning things that are in Torah, have that same dichotomy. Why are you learning it? Someone who's learning science, if they're learning it because they're curious about science, for no other reason, that's unholy. Let me rephrase that. It's not holy, so by definition, it's unholy. Can you learn science for the right reasons? 1,000%, as we'll discuss next week, God willing. I like to end on that cliffhanger because now that's a pretty strong bar that we're putting up there.
It's your call.